Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, to a place often called the Cradle of Civilization, ancient Mesopotamia. You might imagine grand ziggurats reaching for the sky, brilliant innovations like writing and the wheel, and the birth of complex societies. And yes, all of that is true, but beneath the veneer of these incredible achievements, daily life for the average person was, let's just say, significantly less glamorous than the history books sometimes make it out to be. We're talking about disturbing facts about daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, where the line between survival and utter misery was incredibly thin. You might think your Monday mornings are tough, but trust me, a Mesopotamian Monday would make your worst day look like a spa retreat. Imagine the air thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and the occasional waft of something vaguely unpleasant from the drainage ditch that doubles as a street. You're walking through a city built of sun-baked mud bricks, the narrow alleys twisting and turning, offering little respite from the relentless sun. The sounds are a cacophony of animal bleating, the rhythmic thud of artisans at work, and the distant shouts of merchants hawking their wares. This isn't some idyllic, pastoral scene. This is a bustling, often chaotic, and fundamentally hard existence. You're constantly aware of the elements, the sun beating down, the ever-present dust, and the very real possibility that the river, your lifeblood, could also become your destroyer. You would probably not survive a week here without some serious adjustments. Or perhaps a very good stroke of luck. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a world where the foundations of everything we know, law, writing, cities, agriculture, were being laid. But for the individual, life was a constant struggle. Your home, if you were lucky enough to have one that wasn't just a reed hut, was likely a small, dark affair, built of mud brick, with a flat roof that served as an extra living space or a place to sleep on stifling nights. There were no windows facing the street for privacy and security, meaning your living space was often stuffy and poorly lit. Imagine trying to read or do intricate work by the flickering light of a sesame oil lamp. The air heavy and still. Your diet, if you were a commoner, was largely based on barley. Think barley bread, barley porridge, and barley beer. Lots and lots of barley beer, while it was a crucial source of calories and relatively safe to drink compared to water. It was also thick, nutritious, and only mildly alcoholic. So, no wild parties. Just a slightly fermented, gritty beverage to get you through the day. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions or the very wealthy. You might occasionally catch a fish from the river or snare a bird, but your plate was mostly vegetarian and, frankly, probably pretty bland by modern standards. Food security was a constant concern. A bad harvest meant hunger, and prolonged hunger meant starvation. The concept of personal hygiene was, let's just say, rudimentary, while the wealthier Mesopotamians had access to baths and perfumes. For the vast majority, daily washing was a luxury, and often done in the very canals that also served as sources of drinking water and waste disposal. Imagine the delightful aroma of a crowded marketplace, a heady mix of sweat, unwashed bodies, animal waste, and rotting refuse. Public health, as we understand it, simply didn't exist. There were no organized sewage systems in most cities, meaning waste was often just dumped into the streets or canals, creating breeding grounds for disease. This lack of sanitation is a disturbing fact that permeates every aspect of Mesopotamian daily life. Your clothing was simple, likely made of wool or linen, loose-fitting to combat the heat. You probably owned very few garments, and they were mended and remended until they fell apart. Fashion was less about personal expression and more about practicality and social status. You'd know someone's rank just by looking at the quality of their tunic, or the presence or absence of jewelry. And speaking of social status, ancient Mesopotamian society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top, you had the king and the priests, followed by scribes, merchants, artisans, farmers, and at the very bottom, slaves. Your birth largely determined your destiny. If you were born a farmer, you would likely die a farmer, working the same land your ancestors had worked. Under the same scorching sun, there was little social mobility, making the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps a foreign, almost laughable concept. One particularly fascinating, though disturbing. Fact is, the use of clay tablets for virtually everything, even mundane daily notes. Imagine trying to quickly jot down a shopping list or a reminder, but having to press it into a damp clay tablet with a stylus. It was efficient for record keeping on a grand scale, but for everyday scribbling, it was incredibly cumbersome. Your hands would be constantly covered in clay dust. And imagine the sheer volume of tablets required for a bustling city. It gives you a sense of the immense bureaucracy that governed even the simplest transactions. Your days were dictated by the sun and the demands of your labor. Whether you were tilling fields, weaving cloth, or working in a temple, time was measured in shifts, by the position of the sun, or the call to prayer from the ziggurat. There was no concept of a weekend, no scheduled days off to recharge. You worked from dawn till dusk, 6 or even 7 days a week. Your life a relentless cycle of toil, and the only breaks you might get were for religious festivals, which were often more about communal obligation than true leisure. You are constantly reminded that you are a small cog in a much larger machine. Your life, your labor, your very existence serves the gods and the state. Represented by the king and the powerful temple complexes, every grain you harvest, every brick you lay, contributes to the glory of the city and its deities. This communal focus, while building incredible civilizations, often meant the individual's comfort and well-being were secondary. Scholars still debate whether the Mesopotamian individual felt a strong sense of personal identity, or if their identity was primarily tied to their collective role within society. But from your perspective, it probably felt like your life was less about you and more about contributing to the greater whole, whether you liked it or not. So, as you lay your head down tonight, imagine the dusty streets, the relentless sun, the constant struggle for basic necessities. Mesopotamia, the birthplace of so much, was also a place where daily life was a harsh, unyielding grind, a constant negotiation with the elements, disease, and the rigid structures of society. It was a cradle of civilization. Yes, but for many, it was also a cradle of constant struggle. The dust of yesterday's city streets still clings to your hair and clothes as you begin another day in ancient Mesopotamia. You wake to the familiar sounds of the bustling settlement, the distant bleating of sheep, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the incessant chatter of your neighbors. But beneath these seemingly normal sounds lies an ever-present, primal fear, the fear of the very land itself. You are about to face the harshness of the land, a relentless adversary that dictated every breath you took, every meal you ate, and every joy or sorrow you experienced. Imagine stepping out of your mud brick dwelling and immediately feeling the scorching sun on your skin. Even in the early morning, Mesopotamia, or the land between the rivers, was a paradox. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were your lifelines, bringing fertile silt and water for irrigation. But they were also capricious gods, capable of immense devastation. One common historical fact is that the rivers flooded unpredictably. You lived in constant dread of these floods, which could wipe out your crops, destroy your home, and drown your livestock in a single terrifying deluge. There were no sophisticated dams or flood warning systems as we know them today. Your survival depended on the river's mercy, a mercy that was rarely guaranteed when the floods didn't come, or when they were too weak. You faced the equally terrifying specter of drought. The sun would bake the earth into a cracked, unyielding surface, turning your meticulously tended fields into barren dust bowls. Your very sustenance depended on the delicate balance of these two extremes: too much water or too little. It was a constant gamble with nature, and the stakes were always your life and the lives of your family. You probably wouldn't survive a single season here if you weren't constantly vigilant, constantly working to placate the rivers or dig deeper for water beyond the rivers. The land itself was often unforgiving. Much of Mesopotamia was arid or semi-arid, requiring immense human effort to make it productive. You, as a farmer, spent your days toiling under the relentless sun, digging intricate irrigation canals with primitive tools, pushing and pulling a heavy plow, your muscles aching from dawn till dusk. The soil, while fertile when watered, was often heavy and difficult to work, filled with stubborn weeds and the ever-present threat of salinization. Over centuries, repeated irrigation without proper drainage caused salt to accumulate in the soil, rendering fields infertile. This creeping environmental degradation was a slow, silent killer of communities, a process you might witness over your lifetime. Seeing once fertile land slowly die, the materials of your life also stem directly from the harsh land. Your homes were made of mud bricks, baked hard by the sun. Your tools were often simple, made of wood, stone, or later, bronze. There was no easy access to vast forests for timber, or rich veins of metal for mining. Everything you built, everything you used, had to be coaxed from the earth with immense effort and ingenuity. Imagine trying to build a multi-story building using only sun-dried mud bricks, constantly battling the elements and the sheer weight of the material. It required an incredible understanding of your environment, but also a resignation to its limitations. A particularly unique and disturbing detail about the Mesopotamian relationship with their land was the belief that natural disasters were direct manifestations of divine anger. When a flood ravaged your village or a drought withered your crops, it wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a sign that the gods were displeased with you, or with your city. This added an immense psychological burden to the physical hardships. Not only were you battling the elements, but you were also constantly trying to appease unseen, often angry deities through prayers, offerings, and meticulous adherence to religious rituals. You spent your life fearing both the natural world and the supernatural forces that supposedly controlled it. Scholars still debate whether this strong religious interpretation of natural events fostered resilience or fatalism among the Mesopotamian people. Even the very act of travel was dictated by the land, with few roads as we understand them. Most long-distance travel and trade relied on riverboats, making the rivers both a source of life and a means of connection. But what about the journey between settlements not on the river? You would face vast, open plains, scorching deserts, and the constant threat of bandits, all under a sun that offered no mercy. There was no easy journey, no comfortable passage. Every trip was an arduous expedition, fraught with peril and the ever-present harshness of the land. So, as you lay your weary head down, the dust of Mesopotamia still gritty between your teeth. You understand that life here was a constant negotiation with an environment that was both giver and taker. The rivers provided life, but threatened destruction. The soil offered sustenance, but demanded ceaseless toil. The sun warmed your days, but scorched your skin. The harshness of the land was not just a backdrop to your life, it was the very essence of your daily struggle. The relentless sun beats down, a familiar companion to your daily toil in ancient Mesopotamia. You wipe sweat from your brow, the dusty air filling your lungs with every labored breath. But it isn't just the sun or the unpredictable rivers that dominate your existence. It's a far more insidious force law and brutality. In this cradle of civilization, where writing and complex governance were born, your life was inextricably bound by a legal system that was often harsh, unforgiving, and terrifyingly swift in its judgments. Imagine walking through the bustling marketplace, the smell of spices and the cacophony of vendors filling the air. You might see a public notice, etched into a clay tablet, detailing a recent legal pronouncement. It might be about property disputes, or perhaps a warning about theft. But beneath these seemingly mundane announcements lies the shadow of the Code of Hammurabi, one of the most famous legal texts from ancient Mesopotamia, while it established a framework for order and justice. It was also built on the principle of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was the literal, chilling reality of justice in your world. Consider a simple dispute. Your neighbor's ox, perhaps, strays into your barley field and grazes on your precious crop. In our world, you might call the authorities or try to settle it amicably in yours. If the ox destroyed a significant portion of your harvest, the law might demand that the ox's owner compensate you with grain, or, in some cases, even face physical punishment themselves. The severity of the penalty often depended on the social status of those involved. If you were a commoner and the ox belonged to a wealthy landowner, the scales of justice might tip less favorably in your direction. One particularly disturbing, yet common, aspect of Mesopotamian law was the concept of collective punishment. If a crime was committed and the perpetrator couldn't be found, the entire community, or even a specific family, might suffer the consequences. Imagine living in a neighborhood where, if a theft occurred and the thief vanished, your entire street might be held accountable, forced to pay restitution or endure a harsh penalty. This bred an intense sense of communal vigilance, but also a deep-seated fear and mistrust, as your fate was often tied to the actions of others, even strangers. And what about accusations in a world without forensic science or intricate investigative techniques? Guilt was often determined through methods that seem utterly bizarre and terrifying to us. For example, if you were accused of sorcery, a very serious charge, you might be subjected to the ordeal by water. You would be thrown into the Euphrates River if you floated. You were deemed guilty and condemned. If you sank and likely drowned, you were innocent, and the accuser would then be punished. It was a justice system where survival was less about proving innocence and more about defying the laws of physics, or sheer luck. You probably wouldn't survive a legal dispute if you weren't incredibly careful with your words and actions. Beyond the formal laws, there was the pervasive brutality of daily life. Public floggings for minor infractions were not uncommon. Disobedient slaves could face severe beatings or mutilation. The power of a husband over his wife, a father over his children, and a master over his servants was absolute, often backed by the full force of the law and societal norms. Your body was not entirely your own. It was subject to the dictates of those above you in the rigid social hierarchy. A specific, less well-known detail is the practice of talion, retaliation specifically targeting family members for a perpetrator's crime if the perpetrator himself could not be found. For instance, if a man committed a crime that resulted in the death of another's daughter, and the man escaped, his own daughter might be executed in his place. This was an extreme extension of an eye for an eye, chillingly illustrating how family units were held collectively responsible, and how utterly terrifying the reach of the law could be. Historians still debate the frequency of such extreme applications of talion, but its very inclusion in legal codes highlights the brutal nature of justice. So, as you walk the dusty streets of your Mesopotamian city, every step is a careful one. You live under the shadow of laws etched in stone. enforced with a severity that would shock our modern sensibilities. Justice is often swift, brutal, and disproportionate. And your survival depends not just on your labor, but on your constant vigilance against accusation, your adherence to rigid social norms, and perhaps a healthy dose of fear. The cradle of civilization, it seems. Rocked with a very unsettling rhythm of law and brutality, the heat of the Mesopotamian sun is relentless, drying your throat and stinging your eyes. You feel a familiar, dull ache in your muscles from hours spent tilling the fields or hauling water from the canals. But it's not just the physical demands of labor, or the harshness of the land, or even the brutal laws that truly haunt your daily existence. It is the insidious, ever-present specter of sickness and suffering, a reality that would make modern life seem like a miracle of health and longevity. Imagine waking with a fever, your body racked with chills, your head pounding. In our world, you'd reach for medicine. Call a doctor. Here, in ancient Mesopotamia, your options are terrifyingly limited. You might visit a baru, a diviner who reads omens to determine if a god is angry with you, or a ashipu, an exorcist healer, to banish the evil spirits believed to cause illness. Perhaps you'd consult an ASU, a physician who might offer herbal remedies or incantations, but their understanding of anatomy and disease was, by our standards, incredibly rudimentary. They didn't know about germs, about viruses, about the microscopic invaders that ravaged your body. You are entirely at the mercy of forces you cannot comprehend. One common historical fact is the extremely high infant mortality rate. It was heartbreakingly common for children to die before reaching adulthood, often succumbing to diseases that are easily preventable or curable today. Imagine the constant heartbreak of losing child after child, a cycle of grief that permeated every family. This pervasive loss meant that emotional attachments to very young children might have been different. A coping mechanism against the inevitable pain? You wouldn't survive a childhood here without immense resilience and a good deal of luck. Consider the sheer lack of hygiene. As we've touched upon, waste was often discarded in the streets or canals, creating fertile breeding grounds for all manner of bacteria and parasites. You'd drink water from the same canals where people washed clothes. Animals drank, and sewage was dumped. Dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases were rampant, sweeping through communities like silent predators. Skin infections, festering wounds from agricultural accidents, and eye diseases from the dust and flies were everyday occurrences. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptic washes, no basic understanding of sterilization. A simple cut could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene and, very often, death. A particularly disturbing and less known detail is the Mesopotamian understanding of tooth decay and dental hygiene. While they did develop some early forms of dental care, like using certain herbs to relieve pain, rampant tooth decay was a common affliction. Imagine living with constant, excruciating toothaches, with no dentist to pull the offending tooth or fill a cavity. Infection from rotten teeth could spread, leading to severe illness or even death. Food, often gritty from stone grinding, would further damage your teeth, exacerbating the problem. The silent agony of chronic dental pain would be a constant companion for many adults. Scholars still debate the efficacy of Mesopotamian medical practices, but it's clear that many treatments relied more on ritual and belief than on scientific understanding. Even the food you ate, though vital for survival, could be a source of suffering. Grain stored improperly could be contaminated with mold or pests. Meat, if consumed, was often cooked without proper knowledge of safe temperatures, leading to food poisoning. Your diet, while providing sustenance, was a constant gamble with unknown pathogens. You live in a world where disease is seen not as a biological phenomenon, but as a punishment from the gods or the work of malevolent demons. When you fall ill, your family might make offerings to deities or consult a priest to ascertain which spirit has possessed you. The focus is on appeasing supernatural forces rather than addressing the underlying physical causes. This spiritual approach, while offering psychological comfort, did little to alleviate the actual physical suffering. So, as you lay your weary body down on your mat, every cough, every ache, every tremor of fever sends a shiver of dread through you. The cradle of civilization, for all its grand achievements, was also a place where the daily reality for its inhabitants was one of constant vulnerability to sickness and relentless suffering. A stark reminder of humanity's long, arduous journey towards understanding and conquering disease. The last faint whispers of suffering from yesterday's tale of sickness still linger in the dust-filled air of ancient Mesopotamia. You rise from your mat, the morning sun already beginning its relentless ascent, casting long shadows across the mud brick walls of your home. But today, the discomfort of your body takes a back seat to the much larger, omnipresent force that dictates every aspect of your life, gods. Omens and fear. Your world is utterly saturated with the divine. And every cough, every missed harvest, every flickering flame is interpreted as a message, a warning, or a punishment from the pantheon of powerful, often capricious deities. Imagine stepping outside your door and immediately feeling the weight of the heavens upon you. The Mesopotamians believed that the gods were actively involved in human affairs, constantly watching, constantly judging. There was Enlil, the god of wind, air, earth, and storms, whose wrath could bring devastating floods. There was Nana or Sin, the moon god, whose phases influenced your calendar and agricultural cycles, and Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, and fertility, whose whims could bring both joy and destruction. You live in a state of constant supplication, seeking to appease these powerful entities through prayers, offerings, and strict adherence to rituals. Your daily life is a continuous performance for an unseen, all-seeing audience. One common historical fact is that omens were sought in virtually every aspect of daily life, from the flight of birds to the behavior of animals, from the shape of a liver during sacrifice to the patterns of oil on water. Everything was a potential sign from the gods. If you were about to embark on a journey, you might consult a diviner to interpret a dream, or examine the entrails of a sacrificed animal to ensure the gods favored your venture. If a child was born with an unusual physical feature, it could be seen as an omen of a great king, or a terrible disaster. This constant search for divine messages instilled a pervasive sense of anxiety. Every unusual event, however mundane, could signal impending doom or unexpected fortune. You wouldn't make a major decision here without first seeking a divine sign. Consider the role of dreams. If you had a disturbing dream, it wasn't just your subconscious working through daily stresses, it was a divine communication. Often a warning. You would immediately seek out an Ashipu exorcist healer or Baru diviner to interpret it, hoping to understand the god's message and take appropriate action to avert misfortune. The fear of misinterpreting an omen, or worse, ignoring one, was a palpable, terrifying presence in your life, a less obvious, but deeply disturbing. Detail is the practice of substitute rituals for bad omens. If a particularly dire omen appeared, perhaps a plague of locusts, or a solar eclipse indicating the king or the kingdom was cursed, a ritual might be performed where a substitute king was temporarily enthroned. This substitute would then bear the brunt of the omen's curse, perhaps even being ritually sacrificed after a short reign. While the true king would go into hiding, imagine being chosen as that substitute king for a day, knowing you're glorious, albeit brief. Reign would end in death. This highlights the extreme measures taken to appease the gods and alleviate the omnipresent fear. Scholars still debate how frequently such extreme rituals were performed, but their existence in the cuneiform texts speaks volumes about the depth of their religious fear. The temples, massive ziggurats towering over your cities, were not just places of worship, they were the heart of your society. They owned vast tracts of land, employed thousands of people, and were central to the economy. Your priests, often powerful figures, acted as intermediaries between humans and the gods, their pronouncements carrying immense authority. Disobeying a priest could be seen as defying the gods themselves, leading to severe consequences. You might be compelled to contribute labor or goods to the temple, a sacred duty that was also a heavy burden. The gods were not always benevolent. They were often portrayed as temperamental, prone to anger, and capable of inflicting terrible suffering without clear reason. You might meticulously perform all your rituals, offer your sacrifices, and still face a devastating flood or a crippling illness. This unpredictable nature of the divine fostered a deep sense of powerlessness. Your life was a constant attempt to stay in the gods' good graces, a dance on the edge of divine wrath, where one wrong step could lead to ruin. So, as the sun dips below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the land, you light your small lamp and perhaps offer a quiet prayer to the gods. Your daily existence in ancient Mesopotamia is a testament to the overwhelming power of belief, where every moment is permeated by the presence of the divine, and every unexplained event fuels an underlying, all-consuming fear of gods and the omens they send. The sun beats down on your Mesopotamian village, a relentless hammer against the mud bricks of your home. You feel the familiar ache in your back from hours spent toiling in the fields, or perhaps shaping clay for bricks. But for many, the physical burdens of daily life pale in comparison to the soul-crushing reality of slavery's shadow. A pervasive and disturbing fact of existence in ancient Mesopotamia. Imagine walking through the bustling city streets. You see merchants haggling, priests entering temples, and farmers bringing their produce to market. But you also see other figures, distinct in their demeanor and often in their appearance. These are the enslaved, a constant presence, performing arduous tasks, serving in households, or working in the fields and workshops. Slavery wasn't a fringe element of Mesopotamian society. It was an ingrained, fundamental institution that touched virtually every aspect of daily life, from the grandest temples to the humblest homes. One common historical fact is that there were multiple ways a person could become enslaved. You might have been captured in warfare, a spoil of conflict, stripped of your identity and forced into servitude, or perhaps you were born into slavery, inheriting the unfortunate status of your parents. Economic hardship was another common path. A desperate family might sell a child into slavery to pay off debts, or even sell themselves to avoid starvation. If you defaulted on a loan, you could become an indentured servant, working off your debt, often for years, with little hope of truly regaining your freedom. Imagine the gnawing fear of a bad harvest or a failed business venture, knowing it could mean your own or your family's enslavement. Once enslaved, your life was not your own. You were considered property, an object to be bought, sold, or traded. Your master held immense power over you, dictating your work, your living conditions, and often, your very existence. While some masters might have been benevolent, providing adequate food and shelter, many were undoubtedly harsh. There were laws, like those found in the Code of Hammurabi, that stipulated punishments for those who helped slaves escape, or even for slaves who tried to assert their freedom. These laws, while offering some protection to the owner's property, did little to protect the human dignity of the enslaved person. You probably wouldn't survive a single act of defiance if you were a slave. Consider the diverse roles of enslaved people. Some worked in the vast temple estates or royal palaces, performing agricultural labor, construction, or domestic duties. Others were artisans, skilled craftsmen whose talents enriched their masters. Enslaved women often worked as domestic servants, wet nurses, or even concubines, their bodies and their labor entirely at their master's disposal. The system was pervasive, infiltrating every tier of society, from the lowest laborers to the highest echelons of power, a particularly disturbing, though less commonly known. Detail is the practice of branding or marking runaway slaves. If an enslaved person attempted to escape and was recaptured, they might be branded or have their hair cut in a distinct way to signify their status as a runaway. This permanent physical mark served as a constant public humiliation and a stark warning to others. Imagine carrying such a mark, forever identified as someone who dared to seek freedom, forever bound by your past attempt. It was a chilling testament to the society's determination to maintain the institution of slavery. Scholars still debate the full extent of branding practices and their specific meanings across different Mesopotamian periods. While Mesopotamian slavery was generally not based on race, unlike later forms of chattel slavery, it was no less brutal for the individuals caught within its grasp. It stripped people of their autonomy, their dignity, and their fundamental human rights. You might witness a slave being beaten for a minor transgression, or hear the quiet despair in their voices as they perform their endless tasks. Even if you were not enslaved yourself, the shadow of slavery touched your life, reminding you of the fragility of freedom and the brutal consequences of misfortune. So, as you go about your daily routine, whether you are a free person or one bound by servitude, the pervasive reality of slavery is an ever-present backdrop. It is a stark reminder of the social inequalities and harsh realities that underpinned one of the world's earliest and most influential civilizations. A disturbing fact woven deeply into the fabric of daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. The parched earth of Mesopotamia continues to define your existence. From the dust you breathe to the mud bricks of your home, you've navigated the treacherous rivers, endured the harsh laws, and witnessed the ever-present specter of disease and the pervasive shadow of slavery. But even amidst these daily struggles, there's an even larger, more unpredictable force that regularly rips through the fabric of your life war and constant threat. In this cradle of civilization, peace was a fragile, fleeting commodity, and the clang of weapons was almost as common as the rhythmic beat of the farmer's hoe. Imagine a sudden, urgent shout echoing through the streets of your city. It's a call to arms, a desperate plea for every able-bodied man to gather. Your heart pounds in your chest as you grab whatever crude weapon you possess. Perhaps a sharpened stick or a worn bronze axe. This isn't a drill, it's a real and immediate threat. Neighboring city-states, vying for fertile land, control of water resources, or simply greater power, were in a near-constant state of conflict. Life was a perpetual defense, a readiness for the sudden incursion that could shatter your world in an instant. You wouldn't survive long here if you weren't constantly vigilant. One common historical fact is that Mesopotamian history is largely a chronicle of shifting empires and city-states vying for dominance. From the Sumerians to the Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, empires rose and fell, often through brutal conquest. This meant that even if your own city wasn't the aggressor, you were always vulnerable to being conquered, your ruler overthrown, your people subjugated, and your culture assimilated. Imagine living with the constant knowledge that your identity, your language, and your way of life could be erased by the next invading army. Consider the psychological toll of this constant threat. You would live with a low hum of anxiety, a primal fear that the distant shouts on the horizon weren't just merchants, but an enemy force. Farmers tilling fields outside the city walls would always keep a wary eye on the horizon. Mothers would teach their children to recognize the different banners of allied and enemy forces, even during apparent peace. Raiding parties from nomadic tribes or disgruntled neighbors could sweep through unannounced, stealing livestock, burning homes, and kidnapping people. Your sense of security was always tenuous, a fragile shield against a world of violence. A unique and particularly disturbing detail about Mesopotamian warfare was the casual brutality inflicted upon conquered populations. While not always systematic genocide, it was common for invading armies to raze cities to the ground, slaughter large portions of the male population, enslave women and children, and even deliberately destroy irrigation systems to prevent future resistance. Imagine witnessing your city fall, knowing that your home could be turned into rubble, your family torn apart, and your future irrevocably altered by the whim of a conquering king. The victors often boasted of their cruelties on victory steles, a grim testament to the prevailing attitudes toward warfare. Scholars still debate the extent to which these boasts were literal truth or exaggerated propaganda, but the intent to inspire terror was undeniably present. Beyond direct conflict, there was the burden of military service. If you were an able-bodied man, you were expected to serve in the city's militia, to train with weapons, and to fight when called upon. This meant leaving your family, your farm, or your craft to face unimaginable horrors on the battlefield. The weapons were crude, the armor minimal, and the fighting brutal. Death in battle was a very real, very common possibility. Even if you survived, you might return home maimed, traumatized, or bearing the invisible scars of combat. The constant need for defense also meant that your city-state invested heavily in its military. Resources that could have been used for improving daily life, for building schools or better homes, were instead diverted to building massive defensive walls, training soldiers, and manufacturing weapons. You, as a taxpayer or a laborer, contributed directly to this war machine, even if you never lifted a sword yourself. The threat of war, therefore, shaped not only your fears, but also the very economic and social structure of your society. So, as you listen to the night sounds of your Mesopotamian city, a slight tremor runs through you whenever a distant animal cry sounds too much like a human shout. You are a survivor in a land perpetually shadowed by the threat of conflict. Your life is a constant reminder that in the cradle of civilization, the lullabies were often interspersed with the harsh realities of war and constant threat. The sun rises again over Mesopotamia, painting the mud brick landscape in hues of ochre and gold. You feel the familiar ache in your joints. A constant companion to your waking hours? You've endured the caprices of the rivers, the iron grip of the law, the ravages of disease, the shadow of slavery, and the ever-present threat of war. Now, as the day truly begins, you face the most fundamental, inescapable reality of your existence, the rigors of labor. Your life, from dawn until dusk, is defined by relentless, often backbreaking work, a constant struggle against the unforgiving land and the demands of survival. Imagine your hands, calloused and cracked from years of toil. If you are a farmer, you spend your days bent over, working the fields that feed your family and your city. You are digging irrigation ditches, channeling the vital water from the rivers to your crops. A task that requires immense physical strength and precise knowledge of the land. You are plowing the heavy soil with oxen, guiding the primitive plow through stubborn earth. You are sowing seeds, harvesting barley and wheat under the scorching sun. Your body a blur of motion from sunrise to sunset. There are no machines to assist you, no modern conveniences to ease the burden. Every single grain of barley, every single piece of produce, is the direct result of your sweat and muscle. You probably wouldn't survive a single harvest season here without collapsing from exhaustion. But what if you're not a farmer? Perhaps you are a brickmaker. Imagine spending your days knee-deep in mud, mixing clay and straw with your bare feet, pressing the sticky mixture into molds, and then carefully laying the wet bricks out under the relentless sun to dry. This seemingly simple task is crucial, as mud brick is the fundamental building block of Mesopotamian civilization. From humble homes to towering ziggurats, the sheer volume of bricks required for a city is staggering, and each one represents hours of arduous, repetitive labor, all performed under conditions that would quickly lead to heat stroke in our modern world. Or perhaps you are a craftsman, a potter, shaping clay on a hand-turned wheel, or a weaver, painstakingly creating textiles on a rudimentary loom. While these tasks might seem less physically brutal than farming or brickmaking, they still demand immense concentration, skill, and often long hours in dimly lit workshops, inhaling dust or fumes. The repetitive motions could lead to chronic pain, and the precision required meant that mistakes were costly, impacting your ability to provide for your family. One common historical fact is that Mesopotamian society was largely agrarian, meaning the vast majority of the population was engaged in farming or related activities. This highlights the widespread nature of intense physical labor. Even those in higher social strata, like scribes or priests, engaged in demanding mental labor. But the physical grind was the universal experience for the common person. Your very status and survival hinged on your ability to produce, to work, to contribute to the collective effort of the city-state, a particularly disturbing, though less commonly known, detail is the use of forced labor for large-scale public works projects, while not always chattel slavery. The concept of corvée labor was prevalent, where citizens, particularly commoners, could be conscripted by the state or temple to work on massive projects like building ziggurats, city walls, or extensive irrigation systems. Imagine being pulled away from your own farm or craft for weeks or months at a time, forced to labor under harsh conditions, with little compensation beyond basic rations, all while your own family struggles without your presence. These projects, while monuments to Mesopotamian ingenuity, were built on the sweat and forced toil of countless individuals. Scholars still debate the specific organization and duration of corvée labor, but its impact on the daily lives of commoners was undoubtedly significant. The concept of leisure, as we understand it, was largely non-existent. Your days were a relentless cycle of work, punctuated only by sleep and necessary rituals. There were no weekends, no holidays beyond religious festivals, which often involved communal duties anyway. Your identity was intrinsically tied to your labor. You were a farmer, a potter, a builder. Your profession was not just what you did, but who you were. This constant, unyielding demand for physical output meant that your body was a tool, constantly pushed to its limits. With little time for rest or recovery, injuries, illness, or simply old age would render you less useful, often leading to a precipitous decline in your well-being. So, as the sun finally dips below the horizon, casting long, weary shadows, you drag your aching body back to your humble home. Every muscle protests, every bone cries out for rest. The rigors of labor are not just a part of your day, they are your entire day. Every day. A testament to the sheer effort required to simply survive in ancient Mesopotamia. The sun, an indifferent witness to generations of toil, begins its descent once more over the Mesopotamian landscape. You've journeyed through the harsh land, felt the sting of brutal laws, endured sickness, seen the shadow of slavery, faced the constant threat of war, and known the bone-weary exhaustion of endless labor. Now, as the light softens, we turn to perhaps the most poignant and deeply disturbing aspect of daily life in this ancient world, childhood's grim realities. For the youngest members of this formidable civilization, life began not with carefree play, but with profound vulnerability and the early onset of adult responsibilities. Imagine the moment of birth. In our world, it's a time of immense celebration and anticipation, surrounded by medical care and the hope of a long, healthy life. In ancient Mesopotamia, it was a precarious gamble. One common historical fact is the alarmingly high rate of infant and child mortality. A significant percentage of children simply didn't survive past their first few years, succumbing to diseases, infections, or malnutrition that are easily preventable today. Imagine the quiet, constant dread that must have hung over every pregnancy, every newborn, every mother who had already buried several children. Hope was always tempered by the very real possibility of loss. making early childhood a terrifying lottery. If a child survived infancy, their childhood, as we understand it, was often brutally short. There was little time for extended periods of play or formal education for the vast majority. Children were seen as miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household economy from a very young age. Boys would begin learning their father's trade, farming, brickmaking, craftsmanship, as soon as they were physically able. They would follow their fathers into the fields, carrying water, tending to animals, or learning to handle rudimentary tools. Girls, similarly, would learn domestic skills from their mothers, grinding grain, preparing food, weaving textiles, and caring for younger siblings. There was no child labor debate. It was simply the expected order of things. Essential for family survival, consider the discipline. While love for children certainly existed, the methods of discipline were often harsh by modern standards. Physical punishment was common and accepted, seen as necessary to instill obedience and prepare children for the demanding realities of adult life. There was no concept of a child's delicate psyche. The focus was on shaping them into productive, compliant members of a rigid society. You wouldn't survive to adulthood without understanding the importance of discipline and obedience, a particularly disturbing, though less commonly known, detail is the practice of wet nursing among wealthier families and temples, and its implications for both the biological mother and the wet nurse herself. While seemingly practical, it meant that many infants were separated from their biological mothers early on, often to allow the mother to become pregnant again more quickly, or to free her for other duties. The wet nurse, often an enslaved woman or a poor woman desperate for work, would take on the immense burden and risk of caring for another's child, sometimes to the detriment of her own children. This highlights the complex social and economic factors that influenced even the most intimate aspects of child rearing, and the disparities faced by different children from birth. Scholars still debate the psychological impact of such early separations on children and mothers in ancient Mesopotamia. Education, too, was a grim reality for the elite, particularly boys destined to become scribes or priests. Schooling was rigorous and often brutal. Imagine spending long hours in a tablet house, learning to write cuneiform, a complex and painstaking script. Discipline was strict, with physical beatings for mistakes or misbehavior being a common feature of the learning process for the vast majority of children. However, formal schooling was simply not an option. Their education was practical, learned through direct participation in daily labor, preparing them for the only life they were expected to live. Childhood in Mesopotamia was a race against time, a desperate dash to acquire the skills necessary for survival before disease or hardship claimed you. Play, when it happened, was likely informal. Using natural materials, clay, sticks, stones, it was a brief interlude in a life already marked by responsibility, a fleeting moment of innocence before the full weight of adult existence descended. So, as you reflect on the tender, yet brutally short, lives of Mesopotamian children, you recognize that the cradle of civilization was also a place where the journey from birth to adulthood was fraught with peril, where innocence was a luxury rarely afforded, and where childhood's grim realities were an undeniable part of daily existence. The last dust motes from yesterday's tale of childhood's grim realities slowly settle around you, as the pre-dawn hush of ancient Mesopotamia gives way to the first stirrings of a new day. You've journeyed through this remarkable, yet often brutal, world. You've felt the scorching sun, tasted the gritty dust, witnessed the harshness of life by the capricious rivers, faced the cold logic of ancient laws, lived under the constant threat of sickness and war, seen the shadow of slavery, and known the relentless demands of labor. Now, as the faint light of morning begins to touch the distant ziggurat, We embark on our echoes of a forgotten world, gently easing you into slumber with the lingering essence of Mesopotamia's disturbing truths. Imagine, for a moment, the resilient spirit that must have existed within the people who built this civilization. Despite the constant hardships, the floods, the droughts, the diseases, the ever-present threat of violence, they innovated, they created, they endured, they developed writing, allowing knowledge to be passed down through generations. They invented the wheel, revolutionizing transport and industry. They codified laws, attempting to bring order to a chaotic world. These were not easy lives, but they were lives lived with immense purpose, driven by the need to survive and to honor their gods. Your own strength, had you lived there, would have been tested daily, pushing you to limits you never thought possible. One common historical fact that truly echoes through time is the Mesopotamian development of complex astronomical observations in mathematics. Despite the pervasive fear of omens and the arbitrary nature of their gods, they meticulously charted the stars, understood planetary movements, and developed sophisticated numerical systems. This wasn't just for predicting the future, it was for practical purposes like timekeeping, calendrical systems for agriculture, and even for monumental architecture. Imagine the intellectual curiosity and the sheer dedication required to achieve such feats with rudimentary tools, under the very same sky that might, at any moment, send down a punishing storm. Consider the sounds of this forgotten world, now fading into the quiet hum of your own room, the rhythmic thud of a loom, the distant shouts of merchants, the lowing of cattle, the chatter of a busy marketplace, and beneath it all, the ever-present murmur of the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, the lifeblood and the potential destroyer of everything. These sounds, though long silenced in reality, resonate as a testament to lives fully lived. Despite the challenges, they remind us that even in a world vastly different from our own, the basic rhythms of human existence, working, eating, sleeping, fearing, hoping, remain universal, a particularly unique and perhaps unsettling. Echo is the Mesopotamian concept of the Edamu, a restless ghost or spirit of the dead that could wander the earth, causing misfortune. Unlike the more formal afterlife descriptions, the Edamu represented a lingering fear of those who died improperly, or whose graves were not tended. This concept highlights a deep-seated anxiety about the fragility of life and the importance of proper burial and remembrance. Imagine living in a world where even death offered no guaranteed peace, and the spirits of the unquiet dead could return to plague the living. It adds another layer to the daily anxieties, a whisper of the supernatural in the mundane. Scholars still debate the specific cultural significance of the Ademu and its role in daily Mesopotamian fear and ritual, as the final tendrils of this ancient civilization recede. Remember that the disturbing facts we've explored tonight are not just isolated anecdotes. They are woven into the very fabric of how these incredible people lived, loved, struggled, and innovated. They are a crucial part of understanding the full tapestry of human history, reminding us that progress often comes at a steep, often brutal, cost for the individuals living through it. So, as you draw a deep, calming breath, let the echoes of this forgotten world gently carry you away. The dust has settled, the rivers flow silently, and the ancient fears are far, far away. There is only peace, and the soft embrace of sleep.